The Journey of Eadric, written by Andrew Kenway, Part 3. Several days passed since the goblins' attack and the town had returned to normal. The buildings that had been damaged in the attack were in the process of being repaired. Eadric took one more stroll into the woods to make sure that the surviving goblins hadn't returned to avenge their friends. The wild animals had seen to cleaning up the corpses that had been left. "Are you sure you want to make this trip all the way out to Enklen by yourself?" Rayfield asked as he helped Eadric pack up the last of his supplies. "Who's going to help me? You?" "I'll be fine, Rayfield. I have made this trip multiple times with little trouble. I appreciate your concern for my health." Eadric and Rayfield shook hands before he climbed onto the front of his cart and rode off, trying to make as much headway as he could before nightfall. When he was forced to make camp, he found an out-of-the-way spot from prying eyes and made camp. He set up a small fire and leaned against a tree. He pulled a heavy blanket over and tried to unwind. Eadric never liked the trip to Enklen, but it was lucrative for him. Transporting the ore that many kingdoms needed to make weapons and armor paid very well. As morning crept over the trees, Eadric was slow to wake. Sleeping in the wilderness was not the most fun, but the direction he was going meant that he wouldn't see much in the way of towns or villages until he got closer to Enklen. Once he was awake, he ate breakfast before climbing back onto the cart and setting out to continue his trek. The path was boring and slow, but it was one with little risk of danger. Eadric wondered where the last of the goblins had ran off to and if they had returned to their home. After several hours of riding, he passed another merchant heading in the opposite direction. "Afternoon, friend. What brings you out this way?" the man asked. "I'm on my way to Enklen. I have to pick up something and drop things off while I'm there," Eadric told him. "I just left there a day ago. Safe travels, my friend." Eadric waved at the man as he passed by. It was refreshing to see another person on the road. It helped alleviate the loneliness that these trips brought on. He snapped the reins to pick up his pace. After several more hours of riding, Eadric reached Tolson Forest. Nothing about this forest was inviting or welcoming. He snapped the reins again, pushing Halil's into a steady canter. He would spend the rest of the day riding through Tolson Forest, and he didn't want to be here any longer than he had to be. Hours passed without seeing much of the sun. The forest had a dense canopy that shielded much of the sunlight. Every so often, a small beam of light would break through and shine on the path, but it was still rather dark for the middle of the day. As he rode deeper into the forest, Eadric could feel the hair on the back of his neck standing up. He was beginning to get nervous, and he couldn't understand why. He made this trip many times before, but something about this trip bothered him. He felt as if he could read the forest and something was hiding amongst the trees, waiting for him to stop or slow down. He looked around nervously, trying to spot the thing that was watching him. The sound of a loud, deafening screech shook Eadric to his core. Seconds later, a Hesder bull ripped through the underbrush and into the clearing. "A Hesder bull in this area?" Eadric asked aloud. Eadric didn't want to find out why a Hesder bull was roaming this far from the swamps. The boar stood 4 feet tall on all 4 legs. It looked lean and muscular like a direwolf, but it had the tusks and snout of a boar. Its black fur was glistening as it stamped on the ground, preparing to charge. Eadric snapped the reins, sending Halil's into a full gallop. He managed to get a few yards ahead before the boar charged after him. "Just my luck that something this nasty would want to chase me today." Hesder boars were as mean as they were big. They had a short temper and attacked anything that they perceived as food or a threat. It was clear that it saw either him or his horse as a quick meal. Eadric didn't want to fight the boar. Their hides were incredibly tough, and he only had his sword to protect him. Halil's raced at full gallop, but the cart slowed him down just enough the boar was catching up steadily. Eadric looked over his shoulder and groaned as the boar was closing in. "Piss off, boar! I'm not something you eat, you dumb beast!" Eadric shouted. When the boar got close, it began slamming its head against the rear wheel, trying to force the cart to tip, but the wheel wasn't being lifted enough to cause Eadric to lose control. The boar didn't relent, slamming over and over until the cart was rocking enough that it began to sway and caused Halil's to lose its footing and fall over, sliding against the ground as the cart tipped and tossed Eadric to the ground with a bone-crunching thud. Eadric landed hard and bounced several times, his voice letting out a sickening grunt as he rolled to a stop. The boar snorted and grunted as it looked around for Eadric, ignoring Halil's completely. Eadric slowly pushed himself up as best he could. "What the hell? Why are you chasing me?" Eadric knew the boar couldn't respond, but he also couldn't understand why this was happening. There weren't a swamp for miles, but this boar was staring him down and snorting angrily. The boar squealed before charging at Eadric. It attempted to gore him, but he managed to barely escape, leaping up over its head, though getting his feet caught and tripping and falling. The boar turned and charged a second time, hell-bent on tearing Eadric to shreds. Eadric's only goal was to keep his distance from the creature until he could locate his sword. He dodged and weaved as best he could, but finally he misjudged the boar's approach and it slammed into him, sending him rolling along the ground, coming to rest just beside a tree. One of the boar's tusks managed to clip him and put a solid cut in his thigh. Eadric let out a shriek of pain as he clutched his leg. He crawled back to the tree and used it to support himself so he could stand. He looked down and saw his sword was just a few feet away. He limped over and grabbed it off the ground, only to throw himself at the ground as the boar slammed full force into the tree. The base erupted in a flurry of splinters from the boar's tusks digging into it. "This is insane! I have never seen one of these so bloodthirsty," Eadric said to himself. The boar shook its head a few times before it turned around to locate him. It stamped at the ground angrily before charging again. Eadric readied his sword and sidestepped the beast while slashing at its hind leg. He managed to get a slight cut in the hide, but it was incredibly tough. The boar was relentless in its attacks, cutting Eadric's clothes and leaving several deep cuts. Eadric managed to wound the beast enough to slow it down some. As the fight dragged on, Eadric was breathing heavily as the boar made one more charge. Eadric knew that he couldn't sustain any more attacks. He lifted his sword, needing to kill the boar on this last charge. "It's time to cut you down and make you into a coat." The boar snorted several more times before it charged at full force. Eadric steeled his nerve and prepared to thrust his sword. As the boar closed in, Eadric took a step forward and thrust, shoving the sword right into the boar's shoulder as deep as he could. The force of the boar caused the pommel of the sword to be shoved back into Eadric's chest, pushing him backwards and onto the ground. As he fell, the boar tripped and fell forward, barely missing Eadric, but shoving the sword further into its own body. The boar squealed wildly and flailed about, blood pouring from its wound as it tried frantically to remove the sword. As it slowly expired, its last few pain streaks faded off into the forest. Eadric looked over to see Halil still flailing about, pinned down by the toppled cart. "Easy, boy, the boar's dead. I'll get you out of here, but you need to stop thrashing or you might injure us both," Eadric said as he took a knee next to Halil's. Halil slowly calmed down, snorting a few times and looking at Eadric intently, and flailing his head up and down a bit. Eadric pulled the straps on the harness, but with the angle that Halil was laying, it made it difficult. After several minutes of struggling, he managed to free his horse from the cart. Halil's climbed to its feet, taking a few steps away before he jumped and kicked around, relieved to finally be free from his constraints. Halil's walked over to Eadric and placed its head against his chest. Eadric petted him a few times, stroking his mane. After both were settled, Eadric examined the damage on the cart. "This is the last thing I needed today," Eadric groaned. The cart had some significant damage that would require to be repaired before they could set out again. Eadric spent an hour getting his cart repaired and righted with the help of Halil's and some strategically placed ropes. He took the time to gut the boar and then load it onto the back of the cart. He was going to make some money off the meat that this boar could provide, and maybe a coat out of its fur. He was going to make an example of this beast for attacking him. "If another one of those things pops out of the woods, we're abandoning cart and getting the hell out of the woods," Eadric whispered to Halil's as he harnessed him back to the cart. Halil's nodded his head, agreeing with Eadric's decision. Eadric jumped up onto the cart and looked over his shoulder, making sure that the boar was secured before they set off to finish their trip up to England. The cart groaned as Halil's pulled against it and started out. Eadric couldn't help but look over his shoulder repeatedly, expecting something else to jump out after him. It wasn't until he was an hour into his ride that he began to relax. When Eadric finally reached England, a smile crept over his face. He had managed to make it in reasonable amount of time, even with the boar attacking him and forcing him to have to repair his cart. Several people in the town were shocked to see him transporting a Hesder bull. He got strange looks and a handful of questions asked about what he was doing with the boar. Many of the townspeople didn't believe that he had killed it by himself and assumed that he was just telling them a story. He pulled up to the butcher and spent several long minutes regaling him with the story of how he had fought off the boar. The butcher informed Eadric that he would split the meat with him in return for butchering it and would even let him keep the pelt, but it would take him several days to get everything prepared for the trip back. The sound of a few days off was a relief to Eadric. After the fight he had, he quite liked the idea of relaxing and letting his wounds heal. Eadric returned to Crownfall with plenty of supplies. He had more meat than he could eat in a reasonable time and enough pelt to make a blanket. He made a point to distribute as much of the boar meat as he could. Everyone in the town that he gave meat to was more than excited to accept his gift. He took the pelt to see what it could be made into and how much it would cost him. Once his rounds were finished, Eadric returned home and climbed into bed, desperately wanting rest after spending several days traveling. As sleep found him, Eadric once again entered the realm that he had been in before. "Hello?" Eadric called out. "What is this place? Why did you bring me here?" Walking along the grey road, Eadric was looking for the masked woman that he had seen once before. The area felt familiar, and at the same time, he'd felt like he had never seen this place before. He spent several minutes searching for the figure and eventually stumbled on her. "Who are you?" The woman turned her head and looked down at Eadric from her perch. She tilted her head and stared at him for several seconds. "I know you can hear me. What am I doing here?" "You have returned, champion," the female voice called out. Eadric looked around. The voice sounded like it had come from everywhere, and yet nowhere. He swore for a second that he could hear the voice inside of his head. He looked back up at the female and studied her. She was crouched on the roof of a partially destroyed building. "Why did you bring me here? Why do you keep bringing me here?" "I have not brought you anywhere. You came here yourself." Eadric was exasperated by the female's tone. "Why would I come here? I don't even know where I am." "You are here in the world between. This place is my domain." "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head in confusion. "Do you not already know? I am the lady who oversees this domain, the keeper of the world between." Eadric crossed his arms and stared at her, huffing. "That doesn't help me. What is your name? What is this place?" The woman turned her head sharply into the distance, looking at something. She turned and looked at Eadric, the mask hiding the expression on her face. "It seems as if our time together has ended. Until I see you again, my champion." There was extra emphasis put on the word champion, as if she longed to see Eadric again. Eadric wanted to say something, but he blinked for only a second and found himself again in his bed. He slammed his fists down against the bed in frustration. Every time he entered that place in his dreams, he felt a cold chill like death itself had touched him. Waking up from those dreams made him feel more drained than when he had gone to sleep. A heavy sigh escaped his lips as he decided that he would prefer to stay in bed a little while longer. Hours later, Eadric rose from bed and went about his day. "You look like death," Rayfield complimented as Eadric approached him. Eadric's face was one that clearly stated his distaste for the joke. "To be honest, I feel like death right now. I had a fitful night's sleep." "Are you having nightmares?" "I don't know what to call them. Sometimes when I fall asleep, I find myself in this world where no one dwells. It has a gray and lifeless feeling, even though there are trees. Every time I'm there, this woman is watching me. Her porcelain skin is adorned in feathers, and her face is hidden by a mask that resembles an owl. She's always watching me." Rayfield stopped dead in his tracks and looked up at Eadric. "What was this dream you had?" "Last night, I was in this place that felt cold and lifeless. I found a woman with feathers of an owl staring at me from high up on her perch. This isn't the first time. I've seen her there before, but she never moves from her spot. She just sits there and stares at me." Rayfield shuddered before making the sign of the cross and then kissing the medallion that hung around his neck. He looked around for several seconds, checking to see if anyone was walking past. "What is going on, Rayfield? You seem more terrified than I've ever seen you before," Eadric commented. "There's legend of a woman who guides the souls of the dead between worlds. They say that those who see her claim she resembles an owl." Eadric wasn't sure what was going on. He had never heard such a story before, but something about the way Rayfield was talking scared him. He had never seen his friend acting or looking so scared. Rayfield was a man of an iron constitution, but this seemed to shake him to his core. What else can you tell me about this being? All I know is that those on death's door claim they saw her. I don't know much more about her. Only a few people have ever seen her and returned to this world. I can only assume that she is some sort of goddess. Where could I find more about her? Rayfield heaved a sigh and shook his head. I'm not sure where you could go, but I would think that talking to one of the clergy at Hearthsage. I'm sure King Braden would be able to lead you to someone who knows. Eadric finished preparing his cart so that he could deliver more supplies a few towns over. He wanted to travel to Hearthsage immediately so that he could speak with someone, but he knew that he had business to take care of. He shook off the feeling of dread so that he could focus on completing the long list of orders. Once the cart was loaded and Helios was harnessed in, he set off for Becton. Traveling to Becton was one of the easier trips he would make, as he would pass by several large villages and travel roads that were usually heavily traveled by other merchants and villagers. Greetings, traveler. What brings you to our humble town? An old man asked as he saw Eadric riding through the entrance. I'm here to deliver goods. I'm glad you were able to get here so quickly. Eadric nodded and rode through the town until he reached the local merchant. The two men spent an hour unloading everything into his store. What will you do now that you are done? It's almost evening, and there's a blood moon tonight. I would recommend getting a room for the evening. I was wondering if your town had a clergyman that I could speak to, someone who might have knowledge about lore. The merchant stood there thinking about who would best help Eadric with the information he desired. You would best be wise to speak to Pastor Baptiste. He is the local clergy, and he is knowledgeable about things historic. Eadric walked into the town towards the large church that sat in the center. He entered the building and saw a man who greeted him, sitting quietly in the pew with a rosary in his hand. Eadric walked up and took his seat in the pew just behind him. He sat there silently for a second, watching him for any signs of movement. Normally, when someone wants to speak with me, they talk first, or at least give some sort of greeting, Father John Baptiste remarked. Apologies, Father. Normally I would be more friendly, but I come to you with a problem that I'm hesitant to talk about. Father Baptiste tapped on the seat next to him. Eadric got up and walked back to the aisle so that he could sit next to the father. He felt weird talking about what he had witnessed in his dreams, but he thought that maybe he could help get some ideas until he was able to speak with King Braden. What's on your mind, my child? Ever since I returned home from the war at the Strutton Army, I have been having these weird dreams. I don't know where I am, but it's the same place every time. It is a land shrouded in a grayish aura. Everything about it feels cold and lifeless. I've only ever seen this woman in a cloak and mask. Father Baptiste became intrigued by Eadric's story. He turned slightly to face him. A woman, you say? I am not really sure if she's a woman, but her figure resembles a woman, and the voice I heard sounded feminine. She is adorned in feathers and wears the mask of an owl. She is always high up on a perch. She never really moves or says much of anything. She just watches me. Father Baptiste stroked his gray beard for several seconds, while nodding along with the story. And the time she did speak to you, did she say anything? She said that she oversees the realm between worlds, and that she was surprised that I did not know her name. Before I woke up, she called me her champion. It appears that you have met Ziyuna, the goddess of death. Eadric turned sharply, his mouth agape. He was never a very spiritual man, but he was well versed in religion. In all his years, he had never heard of Ziyuna. That name doesn't sound familiar to me. Why would I have never heard someone speak of her before? Because most people who meet her don't return to this world. Usually, people find themselves in her presence when they're near death. It is her job to judge them and take them to the next world. Why do I keep seeing her? I seem to visit her at random times. That I'm not sure of. It's surprising to me. I only know that she is the goddess of death. Why does she look like an owl then? Father Baptiste kneeled, put his hands together in prayer. He looked up at the altar and said, Because she is always watching us. She believes no soul should be left to wander, and like the owl, she sees everything. Thank you, Father. Eadric watched Father Baptiste for a few seconds before getting up and leaving the church. After several days of working, Eadric managed to get enough time to travel to Hearthsage. The last time he was here, he had become a Knight of Panley. He hadn't planned on returning here anytime soon, but he needed more information about what he was seeing in his dreams, and why he was traveling to a supposed place between worlds. Sir Eadric, it is a pleasant surprise to see you again, Sir Raylan said as Eadric approached the castle. I hadn't planned on it, but I am in need of information. Sir Raylan raised an eyebrow in surprise. Is there anything I can help you with? Eadric shook his head. Unless you know something about folklore and the deities that watch over us. Unfortunately, I am unable to help you with that, but one of the scholars or clergy should be able to provide you with the knowledge you seek. I can only show you where the library is. You can start there before you go to the church. Sir Raylan led Eadric to the library so that he could speak with someone about information on the gods. Once they reached the library, Eadric and Sir Raylan parted ways. I was wondering if you could help me with some information that I'm looking for, Eadric said as he approached a scholar inside the library. I will do my best to be of service to you, good sir. What can I help you with? Michael greeted. Do you have any information on a goddess by the name of Ziyuna? Michael seemed shocked when he heard that name. That is not a name that I hear very frequently. There aren't many people willing to speak that name, for fear of her appearing before them. I had some recent run-ins, and that name's come up. I was curious about who this Ziyuna is. If you go downstairs to the archives, there may be at least one book on Ziyuna. Her book will be in Hall C on the shelf 15 under Mythology. Michael pointed down the hall towards the staircase that Eadric needed to take. Eadric took that staircase and descended into the depths of the building. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he heard people talking, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. When he rounded the corner and entered the hallway, he saw Sir Guilford with his arms around a priest, kissing him. He tried to back up slowly, but his foot kicked the open door. So Guilford turned to see Eadric staring at him nervously. The priest turned and ran in the opposite direction, leaving just Eadric and Sir Guilford. So Guilford pulled his hair back and turned to Eadric. Sir Eadric, I'm very surprised to see you. Sir Guilford, that man is a priest. You two are kissing, Eadric said, completely shocked by what he had seen. He is a man of the cloth, but only in spirit. And yes, we were kissing because we are lovers. Eadric had backed up, but Sir Guilford was only a few feet away from him, staring at him intently. Eadric wasn't sure what he should say. He had never seen something like this before, and homosexuality was a grievous sin that was punishable by death in their kingdom. You know that if the king were to find out, he would put the both of you to death. Sir Guilford smirked at the thought of it and let out a sigh. People are always single-minded and can't accept what they don't understand. I am merely following my heart and what it tells me, yet there are people out there that would want to punish me for a choice that does not hurt anyone. I have served the king faithfully for so many years without wavering. Does this mean you are going to tell King Braden what you saw? Eadric was quiet. He locked eyes with Sir Guilford. He wasn't sure how to respond. He knew that he had no right to judge a man for his personal beliefs, but the laws were absolute. The king was very dedicated to the laws of the church, even if it was only one of the many religions that existed throughout the land. Eadric shook his head in response. No, I won't say anything. It's not my place to judge a man. That is a relief to hear. I was afraid that you were going to run to the king and tell him what you had saw. Sir Guilford looked around for a second, surveying the area. This kingdom could use more noblemen like you, but unfortunately, I can't take the chance of you having second thoughts. Before Eadric could ask him what he meant by that remark, Sir Guilford pulled out a small dagger from the sheath on his back and ran him through. Eadric's eyes opened wide as he felt the blade pierce his midsection. His shirt became warm with blood as he held onto Sir Guilford's hands. He looked at Sir Guilford, but saw no remorse in his eyes. Eadric's knees grew weak as he fell to the ground. "Why?" Sir Eadric whispered. "Because I swore to Father Caden that I would protect him at all costs. I'm sorry that you had to see that. I really liked you." So Guilford stared at him for a few seconds before pulling out the dagger and climbing the stairs. Eadric laid there coughing, gasping for breath. His body felt cold and numb. His mind raced through the events that had happened. He tried to call for help, but his voice failed him. He tried to fight the urge to close his eyes, but darkness soon found him. Eadric again found himself in the grayish world that he had visited several times before. He looked down at his midsection, remembering that he had been stabbed only minutes prior. He checked multiple times, but there were no wounds. He tried to get his mind around how he could be here when he had been stabbed. After his mind settled down, he realized that he was in the world that he didn't understand. Like every time before, he was alone. He walked for several minutes before he found himself in the presence of the being that was always watching. "You have returned, my champion. I was wondering when I would see you again," the being called out. "You're Ziyuna, the goddess of death," Eadric said. Ziyuna's posture changed when she had heard her name. She sat up and draped her legs over the edge of her perch, crossing one over the other. "You know my name. That makes me happy to hear you say it. What is this place? How do I get here? I remember being stabbed by Sir Guilford, and then I was here." "You are in the place between worlds. Those who die come here where I judge their deeds and lead them to the next world." "But I have been here before and you've never judged me. I always return to the land of the living." "Yes, that is true. You are quite the anomaly. You come here to me, and yet I know I can't have you. If this is where the dead go to be judged, why am I the only one here? I am sure that there should be other lost souls wandering this world." Ziyuna slid forward on her perch. "Not all souls need bound together. Some are bound to their own strings, and thus wander alone. But you are not one of the dead." She pushed herself off and landed in front of Eadric with delicate grace. Eadric was surprised to see Ziyuna move from her perch. He had never seen her move more than her head before, but now she was standing in front of him. Ziyuna stood almost 7 feet tall, though she had a gown of feathers that covered her form, making it hard for him to know if she was even standing or just floating in the air. He could make out her hair was red, but the owl mask and headdress made it hard to see her face. "If I am not dead, then what am I doing here?" "I wonder that too, my champion. I watched as you were dispatched from that world, and yet I can already feel it pulling you back." "How is it possible? Are you the one who keeps sending me back?" Ziyuna showed no emotion when she spoke. The mask prevented anyone from seeing any expression. Her words felt both heavy and weightless. There was no emotion behind them, but they still shook Eadric like there was a hidden power behind them. "I have not given you such a gift. Mine is not to give life. Mine is to judge and take those souls to the next world. Why is it that I'm able to return to the next world? You were given a gift by someone other than me. You have a gift that the gods do not give willingly. Be warned, this is both a gift and a curse. You should choose your path carefully. There are those who would seek to abuse such abilities." Ziyuna reached up and placed her hand on Eadric's cheek. Eadric was shocked by its warmth. He had expected her touch to be cold and consuming, but he felt warmth and comfort. Her hand slid down his chest as her pointer finger extended and pushed on the center of his sternum. Go now, my champion. There are things you must do. This is the end of Journey of Eadric, Part 3. If you've enjoyed this story and want to hear more, feel free to like and subscribe for Part 4 of the Journey of Eadric.